Good morning and welcome back to Insanity Check. I am your host, Dr. Anita, and I'm so excited to be joined by my co-contributors, Adrian, Eloy, and Sharday. I'm glad that you have decided to stay with us. This month's topic is laboring for justice. It is September, and in September we celebrate Labor Day. And my first podcast, which was Keeping It Real, talked about Labor Day and my personal thoughts on it. And now we're into our second show of the month with Insanity Check, and the topic is laboring for justice. Today we're looking at the question of George Floyd and where are we now? And I'm thinking about the fact that I don't know if we can say protesters, but activities are still going on that are supposed to be in the name of George Floyd, and I'm not sure that it's actually honoring his memory. So let's start by talking about that. And I'm just going to open it up to whoever wants to start. Team, who wants to jump right into this?
I can jump right in.
Okay.
A big part of, I think what we're referring to too is the situation taking place in Portland, Oregon right now. There are a lot of protests that are going on that are escalating towards violence and not necessarily reflecting the original intent of a lot of protesters. And things have escalated really quickly. And I think that's been an important topic of discussion for a lot of people because it kind of brings in the question, is it still, like you said, honoring George Floyd? If it's violent, is that the goal of this movement? I don't know if I'm necessarily completely sure about that answer. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I'm going to be honest, I was a little conflicted. I mean, I definitely don't condone violence in any way, shape, or form, but I understood the rage and the fact that we are kind of put in this box and we're not allowed to go outside of the line. And we see people that metaphorically step into this box and they can do whatever they want with us, but we have to stay in this box. We can't fight back. We can't speak too loud. We can't congregate with too many people. And it's kind of like this outlash, this kind of like we are a ticking time bomb. And so while this is a time for everyone to come together and to share the same voice, it's also like, no, you're going to feel my pain. You're going to hear my cry. And I think when someone gets in that mental sphere, it's kind of like anything can happen. And I feel like it catches like wildfire. You see one person kind of doing something a little violent, kind of throwing a brick, kind of coming with a fire. And it's just like, as afraid as you are, you also feel like this is all I can do to get your attention, to feel heard, to be seen. And so I still don't condone violence. And I don't think that this is the appropriate way to go about things. But if I'm being 100%, I feel it.
When all of this first happened, I remember having a conversation with a friend, and I expressed it as being at the crossroads between frustration and desperation. We have tried to do it peacefully. We have tried to do it diplomatically. We have tried to invite you into our homes and break bread and show you that we're people. We just have a different packaging. And yet and still, because we can't get your attention, this is where we are. And I agree with you 100%. There is no excuse ever for violence. And we think about the strides that Dr. King made with a peaceful approach, and we get that. And we also see how long it took and how we're still not where we need to be. And so to your point, I understand. It comes a point where you're like, you know what, if you're not going to listen to me as a reasonable human being, then let me just show up and show you something different that will get your attention. Unfortunately, I think we had this man's attention. He had our attention when we saw what happened to him, when we saw his murder on national TV. He had the world's attention. And that was the time to be well-spoken and thoughtful and to be able to connect and broaden the dialogue. And I don't know where the breakdown occurred, but it's not honoring his memory at all. Those who might have listened afterwards now have turned a deaf ear because, oh, this is how you guys want to act. And I'm frustrated and bewildered. Eloy, what are you thinking about how this has just degenerated?
Yeah, so and I'll just speak candidly, one of my pet peeves is double standards.
Mm.
And I need to make sure in my actions, in my thoughts, and in my behavior that I'm not propping up double standards. That being said, in researching for this topic, I came across an article written by a gentleman named Michael Harriot for the publication called The Root. And it documents, it gives some of the experiences that led up to this fed up rising, is what he calls it in the article. And the documentation started in 1619. That's 401 years ago, when the first 20 slaves from the West Indies were brought onto Turtle Island, onto North America. And that is minus the violence against the indigenous people and the natives and the first peoples of this country. So I understand it, because protesting is accepted for some and criminalized for others. And after centuries, I find myself asking the question, what do we expect? Now, I resolve all of that within myself by educating myself and by having conversations with people who are still listening, who may not agree with the packaging, may not like the packaging, to be completely honest, but are still listening because they also don't like double standards. So I find myself providing as much context as I can so that we can also provide grace and compassion, because everyone needs grace and compassion. And if I'm going to say that, I need to apply it to everyone, even the people I don't agree with, or even the people whom I can't understand. So I try to be completely honest, even with the parts that are difficult for me to digest, so that I can get to understanding and lead with compassion.
So let me poke you a little bit. So when you say that for some it's protest and for others it's violence, I'm thinking, okay, well, we need to make a distinction, but then I'm also thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong here, are you trying to be politically correct in saying that when the majority protest, no matter what it looks like, it's protest, but when people of color and those that are marginalized protest, no matter what that looks like, it's violence, even if it is a peaceful protest? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, because the terminology that's used is even different. You know, if the protesters if they have things with them, they're said that they're armed. They're armed with spray paints. They're armed with protective gear. But when we see people that have rifles and literal weapons that are counter-protesting, the language isn't that they're armed. And that's not okay, because we are using two different standards for essentially what is the same thing. It's protesting. It's our First Amendment right. So I want to make sure that I'm not applying unfair criticism and that I'm not feeding into double standards, because you said it. We call it one thing when it's the majority, and we call it something else when it's the minority that needs and wants to be heard.
So that goes back to today's topic, laboring for justice. And when we think about some of the generals in the movement for justice, and we think about those that have just recently passed, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Cummings, who are the lieutenants that are waiting in the wings to carry forth? Do we even know who they are? Typically, when people are being groomed, and I'm not just speaking politically, but when people are being groomed, it's usually a private thing until they're ready to bring them out and they're ready to step into their own. So from the three of you, Adrian, Sade, and Eloy, who are the lieutenants? Have they been identified, and who's grooming them, and grooming them for what purpose? Remembering that this is about laboring for justice, and how it seems as though the whole intention around the protests related to Mr. George Floyd's murder seems to have been lost.
Well, personally, this was something that I struggled with after George Floyd. I felt like there was this movement and there were the protests going on, and I felt like I'm not exactly the protest kind of individual, but it was like, what can I do to still be on this train, to still support, to still encourage this movement? And I remember seeing this quote, and it was just kind of like, your activism can look different than everyone else's as long as you're doing something. And I came across this woman, LaToya Frazier, and she's an artist, but she paints different pieces that represent the protests that are going on, the different deaths that have happened across the country, police brutality, even just kind of the educational system and different hierarchies. And I felt like this is a really motivating way to display what's happening. And I feel like it's creative. It's not just something you're going to see on TV or just see a picture on social media. It's going to stop you and you're going to kind of inquire, oh, what is this? And it comes with a little story. And I feel like this is activism right here. This is getting the word out in a way that will inspire people, that will inform and educate people, and even start a conversation.
I love that. It's about what's going to catch your eye, what's going to grab your attention, what's going to make you want to say, I want to learn more about this. And the peaceful, beautiful way to do that is always going to be more effective. Adrian, what about you?
When I thought about this question, my mind immediately went to our Black trans leaders. The Black trans community is, going through a lot right now. And I think with the state of, where we're at in the world, they are so underrepresented and always looked over. And I think reflecting where we're at as a world in 2020, I think our next leaders are these people that are underrepresented, that are overlooked, that are never given the same chances and rights as everybody else. And I just really, my mind goes to them immediately. You think about people like MJ Rodriguez and India Moore, like I talked about with Eloy earlier, and these are people that are championing for equal rights and using their platforms in ways that are effective. And so my mind immediately goes to them.
When we think about people who are marginalized, we need to remember that we all have various intersectionalities within our lives, being Black and a woman and, or whatever you identify with. And when we think about laboring for justice, we need to remember that we're laboring for human rights. We are all equal. And the Constitution says that we are all equal. But some of us choose to still believe that some of us are more equal than others. Eloy, what do you think about that?
Yeah, amidst the frustration of it all, I took a step back and wanted to find people that I can look to for guidance and not just passion and emotion. And I came across a few names, and they're in Congress. One is Hakeem Jeffries, yes. And he is working and bringing to light issues in the prison industrial complex, along with Barbara Lee and Bobby Scott, who is on the Education and Labor Committee as well. So I've been able to focus on what they're doing and position myself in places where I can feel empowered and I can also help.
I love that. And the fact that you're talking about people who are getting busy in regards to justice in the prison system. I'm thinking about the cries to defund the police. And I'd like your thoughts on that, crew, because I understand, back to Sade's point, we can understand the frustration. We can understand the devastation. We can understand the desperation that will cause us to think in ways that we may not normally think when we're calm, cool, and collected, when we have the chance to sit back and reason together. And while I understand the frustration behind the notion of defunding the police, is that really the best thing? And how would that even look to even go about planning for something like that? I mean, we're now in a VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And when you think about defunding the police, we're already dealing with volatility. We're already dealing with uncertainty about how to deal with where we're going now. Now you're talking about complexity around defunding the police and ambiguity as to what that would look like when we need the police. So what are y'all's thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be specific about where we begin. I am a proponent for defunding the police because I read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And that is it's a harrowing book. And it gives you case by case of how our rights as citizens have been stripped and law enforcement has been propped up financially and otherwise. Again, tough pill to swallow, but a reality of our nation. When I say we need to be specific and particular about where we begin, for example, we're all in the state of California and we're on fire. We burn every year, right? Because of our topography and geography. And we have a shortage in people to fight the fires. Why? Because we use prisoners to fight the fires. When we have something difficult as a nation to deal with, we use prisoners first. That's not okay. It's not. So starting in those sections, starting in those places where we have another infrastructure, the fire department, to take care of those things, I think that's where we should begin. Shift the accountability, shift the responsibility back to the organizations that were created to handle these issues so that our prisoners aren't being used and they're being rehabilitated. That's where I say we should begin.
Okay, so this is nSanity Check, and the point is for me to be able to think out loud and explore what's crazy. And maybe it's me, but I think it's crazy to defund the police. Now, I hear your point about using prisoners, and they're not just there to do the things that society doesn't want to do or can't do, or it's too dangerous to approach in a different way. So maybe it's me, but tell me maybe in a different way how the fire department and what you've just said, which I understand, relates back to the police department and how we can still be safe if we no longer have a police department. And let me say this to help you know where I'm going. If we talk about getting rid of guns, well, responsible people don't have a problem with guns. It's the criminals. So if we can't handle that and we defund the police department and now we've got more criminals with guns, I mean, it seems like a never ending circle. So it seems crazy to me. Help me understand where you're going.
Yeah, I think we should start by being specific and very clear, right? So in my opinion, we should take one thing at a time and see how it's funded, because when you follow the money, you know who's benefiting. And typically that's why we keep these organizations, these structures where they are, because there are people in power and influence benefiting. So if we can take, for instance, this one issue, which why prisoners fight fires, and we follow it back to the money, then we can see why we're doing that and see about having a better way to do it. So I think we shouldn't get lost in the huge work and job that it's going to be to recreate our policing in this nation, because we do need policing. We absolutely need policing. We absolutely do. I don't think it needs to look the way it does, though.
Agreed.
So to answer your question, I think we should be specific and start in one place and get each other on the same page there and see how we can move forward.
So I just want to make clear what I thought I heard you say. And you're saying we do need a police department. It's not necessarily we defund it to dismantle it and to absolutely get rid of it, but we need to look at where the money is going in the police department. So for instance, are we training them on how to not approach everything with a nail and a hammer? You can't approach every situation with a gun and ready to shoot. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sade, how do you weigh in on this?
I kind of had your point of view in the beginning. I'm like, I don't really stand for defunding the police. I feel like I'm angry, and yes, I want to take away their ability to have this power, but I also respect what they do. And I know from having friends that are in the force how difficult it is and how you really have a split moment to make a decision. And I think instead of defunding, we need to be retraining. We need to be putting these people in these real life scenarios and show them what can happen and how in that split second you have a choice and there are other options. I think not everyone needs to be armed. I think that should be a privilege. I think that should be a ranking that you get to. While I understand where Eloy is coming from, most definitely, and we should be kind of having a more hands-on effect of where the money is going, I think, again, we can do that through the police. I think they should be transparent in where their funds are going and how they're using it to, whether it's rehabilitating or whether it's training or creating special forces or wherever we can put that money instead of directly into their pockets.
You know, my husband and I sometimes have this conversation, and he likes to say, well, if you get rid of the police and you send out social workers, which is a solution that's been floated out there, he says, you know, even police don't like domestic violence calls because they're dangerous. So you mean to tell me that you're going to send out a social worker to a domestic violence call that even police don't want to show up to? I mean, where does that make sense? And so it goes back to the complexity of what it would look like if you decide to take some of the money that goes to the police department and put it into retraining and helping them with social skills. But how do we even begin to get there? What do you think, Adrian?
I really agree with what Eloy and Sade have said. I agree with like both of your sentiments. I think it does seem crazy to completely defund the police or to try and dismantle the system that's been a part of our society for so long. And it's clearly needed in some ways. But like Sade said, I think it's important to, you know, be able to look at their practices and break it down to a point where you are able to retrain and make sure that, you know, violence, like you said, it's not like being dealt with a nail and a hammer. I think that defunding the police could look sort of like not necessarily a complete defunding altogether, but maybe a sort of funding of other ways that we can handle things, like, you know, thinking about, and again, this is me kind of just thinking out loud. I think about where the problem begins. And for me, the problem begins in the way that the system is built, in the way that, you know, we're taught in schools to believe certain ideas about law enforcement, and we're, you know, sort of conditioned to see things a certain way. And I think if we want that kind of change, we have to look at, you know, ways that we are taking care of conflict in schools, ways that we are, you know, educating young people. And there are so many places this funding, this excess amount of funding, because in my honest opinion, I think the police is receiving far much more money than it needs. I don't think we should be defunding it completely, but I do think the police does get an excess amount of money where there are other really important things to our society that could be receiving funding as well. When we talk about education, when, you know, earlier we talked about, you know, firefighters and people that take care of us in other ways. I think we need to look about, you know, redistributing funding in those ways too. But overall, yeah, to answer your question, I think that it is important that we rehabilitate and sort of retrain in a way, but ultimately, you know, not dismantle the police force altogether, because it's true. I mean, there's no way for us, I think, now as such a developed society to exist without some sort of law enforcement. It is necessary, it's needed. There are situations where, you know, you will need to call the police. And I've seen, you know, solutions online where people have these different types of interpretations of law enforcement. But, you know, like you said, you know, in the situation of like a social worker showing up to a domestic violence call, excuse me, it doesn't necessarily seem to add up the same way. So yeah, I completely agree with you guys. I think it's something that needs to be worked on, and, you know, not completely defunded.
Well, it's definitely a tough conversation. We always say that none of us are experts in these particular discussions, but they're topics of the day. And we want to give ourselves this space to think out loud and to have our viewers think out loud with us and then arrive at their own conclusions. Eloy, I got to say, today you get the prize for getting me to think about things a little bit differently. Adrian, still love you and value you, but I gotta say, my boy over here, Eloy, he kind of brought a whole different perspective. So thank you for that. Always enjoy talking with you, crew. And again, to our listeners, this is the place where I get to ask the question, is this me or is it crazy? And I think it's crazy to defund the police. We've got to figure out a way to do it. Eloy brought up some great points. Sade brought up some great points about we're at a point now where people are just frustrated. And that's where it seems that the protests that were originally sparked in response to George Floyd's murder may have gotten off track a little bit. And why is that? That seems crazy to me as well. But in this month of Labor Day that we're celebrating, let's remember to continue to labor for justice. If you happen to be a lieutenant in the wings, go find a mentor, get yourself groomed and trained and prepared, because This process of laboring for justice is never ending. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for listening with us. Go to our YouTube channel, Dr. Nita, PhD. You have to spell it out, Doctoranita, PhD. You can find this broadcast of Insanity Check and our other programs as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, this is Dr. Nita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real. See you next time, crew.
Bye.